Our book today is entitled, Doing Right Makes Me Happy. The book Doing Right Makes Me Happy was written by Cara Lynn Phillips and illustrated by UNADA. That gumdrop sure looks good, thought David. Too bad we don't have enough money to buy it. He pressed the freckles on his nose flat against the drugstore window, looking at the biggest, reddest, most sparkling sugar-coated gumdrop he had ever seen. David thought about asking his mother for 50 cents to buy the gumdrop, but he knew what she would say. I wish we could buy it, but we don't have enough money to buy candy or toys. I know, he said to himself. Maybe I could ask a neighbor if I could pull some weeds or take his dog for a walk or something. Then I could get some money and come back and buy it. But his smile became a frown. It might be gone when I get back, he thought. That will never do. David walked slowly to the door of Pete's drugstore and reached up to grab the metal handle. He tugged at the heavy door until it opened up enough for him to slip inside. The door banged shut behind him, and the bell on the handle jingled loudly as it hit against the glass. Pete looked up from his cash register where he was making change for Mrs. Brown. "Hi, David," he said. "Hi, Pete," David said quietly, looking at the round, fat man with the bald head. David liked Pete. He'd known him all his life and knew that Pete was always nice to the kids in the neighborhood. Pete went back to helping Mrs. Brown. David walked slowly toward the shelves where Pete kept the candy and gum and the big red gumdrops. There were 2 gumdrops left on the shelf. Each one was gigantic, at least to David, who was still not very big himself. The gumdrops were neatly wrapped in shiny paper. David was so close he could almost taste the sweet flavor. He picked one up and held it in his hand. His blue eyes sparkled and his mouth started to water. Boy, I wish I could take this, he thought. Then he thought again. I can take it. No one would ever know. He was just going to put it in his pocket when he heard the bell on Pete's front door jingle loudly. It made him jump, and he put the candy back on the shelf as quickly as he could. When he turned around, the lady who walked in smiled and said, "Hi, David." "Hi, Grandma," he said, surprised to see her there. "I came over to Pete's by myself." "I can see that," she said, messing up his hair. "Does your mother know where you are?" "Uh-huh," he said. "Mommy said I could come and look around." "Well, I have to get some shopping done," she said as she walked on by. "You be good now." Grandma said that all the time, but this time it made David wonder if she saw him holding the gumdrop when she came in. Grandma was talking to another lady now. Nobody was looking at him. He looked back at the gumdrop still sitting on the shelf. No one would ever know, he thought. He picked up the same gumdrop again and looked at it for a long time. Then he quickly stuffed the candy into his pocket. David felt like everybody around him could see what he had done. He was afraid that Pete or Grandma would holler at him any minute, but nobody did. For a minute he stood there and picked up the other gumdrop. He just looked at it, put it back on the shelf, and walked out the door. The bell seemed very, very loud when the door closed behind him. He was outside the store with the gumdrop safely tucked into his pocket. David's stomach felt funny. He walked slowly down Elm Street away from Pete's drugstore. I wanted that gumdrop so bad, he thought. He looked back over his shoulder to see if anyone was coming after him. He was almost home when he took Pete's gumdrop from his pocket. He stopped walking and stood looking at the bright red candy in his hand. If nobody else knows I took this, how come I feel so bad? He walked up the steps of the apartment where he lived and put his hand on the doorknob. I remember something my Sunday school teacher said, he thought. The Bible says that stealing is wrong, and I think I know why. This gumdrop isn't mine. I cheated Pete. David went into the building and went straight to his room. He opened the top drawer and hid the big gumdrop beneath his socks. After dinner, when it was time for bed, David couldn't get to sleep. All he could think about was the big red gumdrop in his drawer. I'm going to take it back in the morning, he thought. I gotta go tell Pete what I did. The next morning, David dressed faster than most mornings. He gulped down his breakfast and went back into his room. He pulled open the drawer and dug around in his socks until he found the red gumdrop. He pushed it into the pocket of his jeans and ran out the door. When he got to the drugstore, Pete was just opening up. Pete, he said, I gotta tell you something. Well, come on inside, Pete said, pulling his key out of the lock and holding the door open for David. When they walked into the store, the first thing David saw was the shelf with one red gumdrop left on it. Pete, David said quietly, you know those gumdrops you sell? Pete nodded his head up and down. Well, said David in a little voice, I took one yesterday because I wanted one so bad and we didn't have any money. David dug deeply into his pocket and pulled out the gumdrop. Holding it out to Pete, he said, I don't want to cheat you. You're my friend, and the Bible says don't steal 'cause it's bad. Pete took the gumdrop from David and said, David, stealing is always bad, but I want you to know I'm proud of you for bringing this back to me. It took a very brave young man to tell the truth today. David left the drugstore feeling much better. He thought, Pete's a good friend, and I was wrong to cheat him. Telling the truth isn't so bad after all. Besides, doing right makes me happy. And that is the end.